Hello there. I'm sure you've heard people talking about intermezzo. It's the new Sally Rooney. Everybody's jumping on board this book. I personally have never read a Sally Rooney. I've been meaning to. I've just never really gotten around to it. I've never read an author's entire catalog from like start to finish, and I thought it would be so interesting to see like how she has evolved as a writer. So I have basically everything that she's ever published. I think there's been a short story collection. You can't get it anywhere. I'm not including that. Every author has published a short story collection. I'm sorry. I'm not going to read them all. But this is like the Sally Rooney canon. We have Conversations with Friends, Normal People, Beautiful World, Where Are You, and Intermezzo. I don't really know exactly what I'm getting into here. I know these books aren't going to be like the weird books that I typically like to read, but I think that it is going to be very well written, Irish literary fiction, and that's exciting. So I'm really just sitting down here right now to tell you that I'm gonna go start Conversations with Friends, and I'll talk to you when I've read some of it. Hello, I've finished Conversations with Friends, a book with a horrible cover that I actually really liked. This follows Bobby and Frances, two young women who know each other from high school. They dated for a year and then broke up, and they are best friends and they perform spoken word poetry together. Thank God, because I was worried about it starting it out. It doesn't make you read any of their poetry. There's no poetry in this book. We don't have to like really hear about them performing. It's kind of something that they did before the events of the book. Frances is our narrator. She's kind of this tightly strung woman who's always experiencing a low-grade anxiety. She is a lot more than that. That was just my first impression of her. I found her very compelling right from the start. She's somehow both boring and interesting at the same time, and in the beginning, she kind of reminded me of Joan Didion in a way. I think the two of them have a similar voice. This is an entirely character-driven book. Like, the whole thing is about the characters, and there's a really interesting contrast between Bobby and Frances. Frances is quieter, Bobby is louder, Bobby is more opinionated, she's headstrong, she's definitely like a leader, she's very outgoing, she seems not to care all that much what other people think about her. She has a really strongly formed sense of identity, and Bobby is the performer of the two, where Frances writes the poetry that they perform. Frances is more observant, she's not a risk taker, she's very much like an artist type, a feeler, and a thinker. And the book starts out with them meeting this semi-famous essayist and photographer, Melissa, who is married to a man who's an actor. He's a little bit more famous than her. They're not like super famous, and this is Nick. They meet Melissa at the bar, and then she invites them back to her house and wants to photograph them. There at the house, Bobby clearly has a crush on Melissa, where Frances has a crush on Nick. Nick is this kind of cool and aloof character to begin with, and he does express an interest in Frances, whereas Melissa obviously sticks onto Bobby right away, and Frances perceives Melissa as not liking her very much. And Melissa wants to write a piece on Bobby and Frances as these two women that perform poetry together, and that's kind of how the two couples cling to each other through the book. Both couples are part of a sort of similar art scene in Dublin, but Bobby and Frances are quite a bit younger than Melissa and Nick are, so they see each other sometimes, but they're mostly connected through this piece that Melissa's writing about the two of them. And because Melissa really seems to like Bobby. Melissa invites the both of them to her birthday party at her house, where Frances goes and finds Nick, and they're alone in a room together, and Frances like waves her face like she's hot, like she's fanning herself, and Nick holds his cold beer can to her face and the back of her neck and her thigh, and then they kiss. He's obviously a married man, and he says, "We shouldn't do this in here." And so she leaves, and he also leaves. They don't meet up again at this party. Frances ends up finding Bobby, talking to her a little bit, and then leaving the party. Frances and Nick had been keeping contact with each other over email. Frances had gone to see Nick perform in a play, and then Nick was supposed to watch Bobby and Frances perform their poetry together, but he showed up late and he missed the whole thing. So he said, "Oh, email me some of your work so I can read it." And then that started a correspondence between them. After this kiss, they kind of stop emailing until Melissa goes out of town. Frances asks to go over to talk, like presumably about this kind of awkward thing that has happened between them, but she brings her toothbrush with her. That night, Nick tells her that Melissa has had multiple affairs where he's had none, which definitely eases Frances's sense of guilt about this. They have sex that night for the first time, and then Frances ends up staying with Nick almost every night of the week that Melissa is gone. Bobby almost sees a message from Nick to Frances, and Frances in this moment acts incredibly childish, which is so interesting because she thinks she's so grown up, like as this 21-year-old about to graduate college, like still kind of in the middle of college. She wants to portray a version of herself that is a lot more mature than she actually is, and you can see her age when she responds to Bobby saying like, "Well, good for you," when Bobby says, "Oh, I saw that it was from Nick." And it kind of reminds you of this unequal power dynamic between Frances and Nick. Nick being kind of famous, like having a lot more social capital than her, a lot more money than her, and being over 10 years older than her. There has been a lot of build up towards Nick and Frances coming together and like being a couple, and it's not this perfect relationship after all of this build up and all of this wanting on Frances's side. Nick is not very affectionate. He's not mean to her, but he's not very nice to her. And she wants him to be, but she also can be sometimes cruel. I think Sally Rooney does this thing with her like strong like leading women characters where when they are vulnerable or emotional they respond with coldness and cruelty, and that's interesting. Like it's not like Frances is like this little puppy dog like pining after him like on her hands and knees begging for him to be nice to her. Like she can also be mean and lash out. And she wants him to think that she's just doing it for sex. She wants him to think that this is not this huge thing that it is to her. Melissa gets back from her trip and Nick breaks things off with Frances over email saying like, what were we supposed to do when my wife got back? Like we obviously can't keep doing this. Frances is heartbroken, but then Melissa invites Bobby and Frances to stay in this vacation home that's owned by Melissa's sort of mentor figure, this woman named Valerie, who's a lot older than them, and they go to stay in this vacation home for a week. While they're staying in France, Nick and Frances make up. Nick tells her that her coldness over email made him think that she just wanted to be left alone. This is a Sally Rooney thing. I've only read one book, but I have seen Normal People, and I know that it's very similar to the book. This miscommunication, and it's so fucking realistic and I love it, but it's also so frustrating at the same time. Every night of this vacation, Nick and Melissa sleep in separate rooms. They sleep in separate rooms at home and at the vacation house. Every single night, Frances goes into Nick's room and they have sex with each other while his wife is upstairs sleeping. Bobby knows that Frances has a crush on Nick, and Frances obviously knows that Bobby has a crush on Melissa, but Bobby does not know the extent of it. Frances is keeping this very close to her chest. Bobby wants to turn this little crush, which she also notices that Nick has on Frances, into this funny thing, into this joke, like turn this secret into something else. They play this sort of 20 questions game while they're in France where everybody puts a whole bunch of celebrity names on slips of paper, puts them into a bowl, and then they have to pull a name out and then people ask questions and you respond and you have to guess who the celebrity is. Bobby writes Frances's name on a slip of paper. Nick pulls it out and Bobby asks a whole bunch of questions trying to embarrass Nick, saying like, do you have a crush on her? Do you think she's good looking? Like that kind of thing. And it does. It embarrasses everybody. And it's clear Bobby is doing this in some ways to hurt Frances and to hurt Nick. Frances goes to the bathroom. She's a little bit upset. And when she leaves the bathroom, Melissa is there. And Melissa says, has my husband been bothering you? You are not expecting this when it comes, because Frances's perception of Melissa is so different than the reality. It's obviously way easier for Frances if Melissa is like an unlikable bitch. And that is how she chooses to perceive her. And that's not the whole truth of Melissa's character. So there's this moment of kindness where she is like empathizing with this 21-year-old college student thinking like my husband has been creeping on her, and she takes the side of Frances. And as the reader, you're like, oh my god, I had just adopted Frances's opinion of Melissa and we were both wrong. That night, Frances picks a fight with Nick, which is something that she does often. This is a display of her agency. She does it when she realizes that she has no power in this relationship. She's like overcome by her emotions, and he has all of the power in the relationship. She also has no one to turn to talk to about this because she has left Bobby completely out of it. Then Valerie, the owner of this vacation home, I think she's like a 60-year-old woman, she comes to stay for a few days. And this makes tensions run high. This is incredibly stressful for Melissa. We don't really know what the dynamic is between the two of them, but as soon as it's the day that Valerie's coming, like everybody has to be doing very specific things. Like the dishes need to be cleaned 3 or 4 times until they're clean enough. Like it's a very stressful situation. Melissa sends Nick grocery shopping and he forgets to get lemons and she acts like she's about to faint. Valerie shows up and she's like old money, mean. She knows her power and she flexes her power. Like this is her house. She can say whatever she wants and get away with it. She never really addresses any comments or questions or even eye contact towards Bobby or Frances the entire time during this dinner. And then Nick goes to make coffee, and while he's gone, Valerie starts talking about his health, spreading all these secrets about him, saying like, you know, he has really intense depression, which is something that Frances already knows, but Frances loses her temper at this, at Valerie talking about Nick behind his back like this, which is kind of intense because of how much pressure there has been on Valerie staying with them and how we know that Melissa wants everything to go perfectly. And there's this expectation. Frances ends up like leaving and going and like being dramatic and sitting on the beach in the rain crying, Bobby comes and finds her and makes her come back inside, and there's this expectation the next time Melissa and Frances are alone that Melissa's going to be incredibly upset with her because she kind of ruined this dinner. But Melissa ends up telling Frances that she doesn't like Valerie either, and she doesn't like the way that Valerie talks about Nick. And Frances apologizes, and Melissa says, "You have nothing to be sorry for. If I had a spine, I would have done the same thing. But the only way my next book is going to be published is through Valerie's help. So I need to maintain myself on her good side." This is just another moment of Melissa being a more complex character than Frances has allowed her to be. And I love it. I think it's powerful and striking. In this conversation, Melissa asks Frances if her and Nick are sleeping together. Obviously, Frances denies it. Melissa says, "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked that." When Nick and Frances are in Nick's bed that night, Bobby knocks on the door, and she says, "I went into Frances's room and I can't find her. Should I go looking on the beach? Should we wake everybody up?" And Nick says, "Oh, fuck, she's in here." And that is the end of part 1. Bobby figuring out the extent of what's going on between Frances and Nick. Part 2 starts with her getting home from France. She has a medical emergency on the day that she gets home. It's something to do with her period. She's bleeding a lot. She's in an insane amount of pain, and she thinks that she's having a miscarriage. She goes to the hospital. They say, "It's not a miscarriage. You weren't pregnant." This is obviously a whole thing, her dealing with, "Oh my God, I could have been pregnant. Oh my God, I lost the pregnancy. And then I wasn't pregnant, but I still had all of these feelings. Am I allowed to feel those things?" It's a very interesting exploration that I'm definitely dumbing down a little bit too much, but it's hard to get into all of the things that Frances feels about everything, because this book is so rooted in her feelings about everything that happens to her. The hospital says, "Have this ultrasound. It's booked for November, which is months out," which she thinks is crazy and is just kind of the state of public health care. I get it. I live in Canada. Frances has a slightly different class status than the people she spends her time with. Bobby's family is quite rich. Obviously, Melissa and Nick have a lot of money, being these semi-famous people and quite a bit older. Frances didn't grow up in poverty, but she doesn't have the extensive spending money that everyone around her has. She does have free accommodations, though. She lives in an apartment that her dad's brother owns, and Bobby moves into this apartment with her. She doesn't really work. She has an internship that she kind of goes to. It's not a huge part of the story. She doesn't have any goals or aspirations for what she wants to do with her life. She doesn't dream of having a job. She's run out of money, though, because her dad, who pays for her to live, gives her an allowance every month. He's struggling incredibly. He was a very difficult father. In an emotionally and sometimes physically abusive way, he struggles with alcoholism, and it has just been ramping up over the course of this book. At one point, she goes to visit him. He almost never answers the phone anymore. She goes to his house, and she enters, and the fridge is left open. Everything is rotting. There's maggots and flies and bugs. It stinks. You kind of think in this moment that she's going to find him dead there. She doesn't, but it's obvious that he's really not doing well. During this time, Valerie reaches out to Frances and says that she's interested in reading some of Frances's work. Frances is happy with this because it's obvious that she's left an impression on Valerie, and Valerie is interested in her. Frances sends Valerie the first prose story that she's ever written. She's entirely been a poet up until this point, but in this frenzy, she writes this story. She doesn't even check it for errors. She sends it to Valerie, and then a couple months later, an editor from some literary magazine says, "Valerie sent this piece that you wrote to us, and we want to publish it for $800. She needs the money. She has no fucking money. So of course she agrees to it. She's still been seeing Nick. She gets upset with him. They get into this fight, and she tells him the problem isn't that I want you to leave your wife. The problem is that I love you and you don't love me. And they kind of stop seeing each other after this argument. But then she has another one of these medical episodes, and Bobby calls Nick. And when Nick shows up, he says, "I've told Melissa what's going on between us, and she's okay with it." And so there's now this permission for them to have this affair. Then Frances gets this email from Melissa, which is, oh my God, so juicy. It says, "Melissa emailed me," and you're what did she say? She says that she's not mad at Frances. It's kind of this torrent of emotion. It's very writerly. It's very, very intense. She kind of rips Nick to shreds in this email, saying that he has a weak personality and compulsively tells people what they want to hear. So she wants to email Frances to make sure that everybody's on the same page, that Melissa and Nick are going to remain married, and that Nick is not ever going to leave Melissa to marry Frances, that this is an affair for him. Most importantly in this email, Melissa tells Frances that the relationship between Frances and Nick has improved Nick's depression so much that Melissa just can't bring herself to deny him it. She wants him to be happy. She says, "I want him to be happy even if this is what that looks like. Like, instead of just lying on the couch all day, unable to move, won't even grab the remote and change the channel, he's like up in the mornings, he's cooking, he's listening to the radio. Like, Melissa sees that it's undeniable that Francis has helped him out of this depression that Melissa thought might never end. She says, "Are you making my husband better, Francis? What gives you the right to do that?" Crazy line. I love it. It's such a good email. It's like 3 or 4 pages, and the whole thing is so interesting. It's such a great glimpse into Melissa's head. She's going back and forth between so many emotions. Like, she is angry, but she also isn't at the same time. It's so hard to explain. It was probably my favorite part of this book. Then a whole bunch of shit starts going wrong for Frances. Bobby is sent the story. Melissa sends her the story that Frances has written, and this story is explicitly about Bobby. And she moves out that night. She's incredibly upset that Frances has written and published this story about her and not told her that it was happening. I feel like there's so much in the relationship between Bobby and Frances that I'm missing here that I just did not take good enough notes on. They have an incredibly interesting and tender and like hostile relationship sometimes, and there's so much history between them. The book starts out with telling us that they had dated for a year in high school, that Bobby had broken up with Frances, and then they just remained so tightly like woven into each other's lives that they're still in some sort of relationship. After Bobby moves out, they completely stop talking. Frances is then honestly way too quickly diagnosed with endometriosis. It felt quite unrealistic, but I understand that this story takes place in a very short period of time, one in which a woman would not be so quickly diagnosed with endometriosis. That just doesn't happen. But for the narrative, I understand why it needed to. Nick calls her the night of this diagnosis where she's dealing with so much, like this is an incurable disease, and he tells her, "Melissa and I have started sleeping together again. I just wanted to let you know." Frances ends up breaking up with Nick entirely, like hard line cut off. We're not seeing each other anymore after all this like on and off stuff, partly because of how she feels about this diagnosis. She feels like she doesn't want to be seen as sick, and when they have sex that night before she breaks up with him, she's worried that he can like feel something different inside of her, like now that she knows that she has this diagnosis, even though it's always been there and she knows that. I mean, like, endometriosis is so related to sex. Like, it can cause pain during intercourse, it has issues with fertility, like they are intricately linked here, and this diagnosis is a big part of why she breaks it off with Nick. Also, obviously, she feels very jealous of Melissa. During the period of time after all this shit goes down, obviously Frances becomes incredibly depressed and lonely. She has really no one in her life, but life goes on. Like, she keeps going to lectures, she keeps being quite ill. She can kind of get her symptoms down, but once her medication runs out, it all comes back very quickly. She's fainting a lot, she's in a lot of pain, but she's pushing through it. It doesn't feel like she's pushing through it in like a healthy way, but she is like still like living her life. She has this experience where she's in really intense pain, and so she goes and sits in a church because she can't keep walking to wherever she's going. I don't really remember. And in this church, right before she faints, she has this like enlightening experience where she like just grapples with her identity. She starts thinking of things really, really small because she's having a lot of anxiety about the health crisis that she's like actively in. She thinks about the pew she's sitting on and the people that made it and the people that made the sidewalk and who laid the tiles down. And then she starts thinking about who she is and like, is she her or is she an accumulation of all of the people around her? It's a beautiful moment. I love that she faints afterwards. And after she has this experience, she emails Bobby to apologize and to confess her love for Bobby. It's another weird writerly email that I also love. She says, "Is it possible we could develop an alternative model of loving each other? I'm not drunk. Please write back. I love you, Frances." That night, Bobby shows back up, opens the door with her keys, and Bobby moves into Frances's room, and they start this relationship-ish. They're sleeping together, but Bobby refuses to call them girlfriends because it's like too capitalistic. Bobby has these opinions. They really do get into like a lot of commentary about like what these characters believe about the world that they live in. Bobby is kind of stereotypically like leftist college student, queer woman. More than I'm portraying it, this relationship between the two of them was kind of set up from the beginning. Their relationship has always been incredibly intense and with so much jealousy between them. I thought that was where this book was going from the start, because the first dynamic that's established is I mean, between Bobby and Frances, but then between Bobby and Melissa, and Frances is obviously jealous of it. And then it gets into all the Nick stuff, and Bobby kind of falls to the side, but she's always an important aspect of Frances's life. And in this relationship with Bobby, and in the absence of Nick, Frances is happy and she's loved. And then one day, Nick calls her accidentally, and he says, hey, they don't have red peppers as yellow, okay? Obviously, he's trying to call Melissa, but they stay on the phone with each other and they talk about what went wrong between them. They hash out all of these miscommunications that have happened over the course of the book. He tells her that first night that they kissed, when he said, we shouldn't do this in here, he had gone upstairs to his bedroom and waited for her for hours, which is like, I kind of hate their relationship, but I do love that. And he said that he stood there waiting for her to come into his room and he couldn't leave because he kept imagining that as soon as he started to leave, he would hear her coming up the stairs. Like, he just couldn't move from his spot in case she did finally decide to come up there. And then he says to her, if I told you where my car was right now, I wouldn't be able to leave in case you decided to come to it. And the book ends with her saying, come and get me. So they go back to each other, but we don't really get to see anything. Oh my God. It was that last line, I was like, fuck. It was a great line, but also not what I wanted for her. I thought this book was incredibly well written. It was a great debut. There were so many things that I loved about it. I was shocked by how quickly I was reading it and how pushed through it I felt, even though it is just like simple character-driven literary fiction. I liked how I didn't always, my perception of Frances didn't always line up with her perception of herself. Like, she calls herself emotionally cold, which is not really a way that I would describe her. This is kind of a coming-of-age story, so a lot of it is about her discovering what her identity is and her sexuality and her relationship with desire. Like I said, there's so much miscommunication here. So much very human miscommunication. Like wanting someone to think one thing, a thing that isn't the truth, and then being upset when they behave in the way that someone who thinks the thing you want them to think would act. Or keeping secrets by accident, planning on telling someone something and then just never getting around to it. Always in the back of your head, like, I could say this, and then not saying it over and over again. The greatest strength here is Rooney's control of dialogue, both in person talking to each other and online. She does a very good job figuring out the differences between those two. People have these two separate voices in person and online, but it's always their voice. It's so hard to describe. She just does a really, really good job of it. I also found myself loving the way that she ends chapters. It's not like this big shock twist that's oh, I gotta get to the next chapter, but it's often this evocative image that is quite beautiful and tender. There's this one chapter where they're bussing into the vacation home in France after their flight, and Frances falls asleep and she wakes, and the chapter ends with, I wake to Bobby gently tugging on my hair. I don't know why. That just stuck with me. I liked it. There was such complexity with all four of these main characters. They were so full and so vivid, and the dynamics between them and the ways they thought about each other, it was just so fleshed out. And they could all be insufferable and cruel, but they're so human and so relatable that it was hard not to like them and feel invested in what was happening to them. I think that was part of why I felt like there was so much momentum in this story. I loved these characters, and I hated them, and all at the same time, and I wanted to know what was going to happen to them. They were so alive, and there was this human messiness to it, similar, I know, to Normal People, because like I said, I've seen the show. No one could figure out what they wanted or what they needed in life. There were so many good lines in here. It's just a well-crafted story, fantastic for a debut. There are a couple things that I think I would like to see her do better in her newer works. Sometimes it's a little bit too melodramatic, oh my God, which honestly for this kind of works because Frances is 21 years old. Who's not melodramatic at that age? I thought that some of the metaphors fell a little bit flat, and I think the tagless dialogue is almost done well, or almost done perfectly, but sometimes I'm confused about who's talking. That doesn't often happen to me with tagless dialogue. I'm pretty used to reading that. I think that she didn't do the best job of it here, and I'm sure that there's space for improvement there. But overall, thematically, characterization-wise, story-wise, narrative-wise, this is a fantastic book, and I enjoyed it a lot more than I was expecting to. I think the cover of this really throws me off. This does not portray everything that's in here. It's quite a bit darker than you would expect from this cover. Something that I think might be an issue is that reading this, I could tell that a lot of the same story beats are hit in Normal People. So I'm wondering if I might, at the end of this, be bored of Sally Rooney. I know Intermezzo has a very different story than these two, so maybe it'll be okay, but I wanted to film this and talk about this book before I got too far into Normal People because I was worried they would blur together a little bit. And like overall, that's not a problem for these books to be very similar. Conversations with Friends is a great book. Normal People, I love the characters so much. I started this and it's such an interesting experience because it's so different than if I had gone in blind, never having watched the show, not knowing anything about it, because instantly I'm already endeared to the characters. I already know Marianne and Connell and I already love them and I'm excited to be like entering their world again. So there's definitely some bias there. Like I am not experiencing this in the same way as someone who had never entered the Sally Rooney universe would. And I didn't experience this in that way either. Like I could see a lot of Marianne in Frances. They're not the exact same character, but they have some qualities that are similar. Again, it hits a lot of the same story beats. Like we're doing the same stuff in here a lot. Not an issue. Most people are not reading these books back to back to back. I'm just worried I might get a little bit bored. Though, having read like 20 pages of this, I'm honestly really excited to be with these characters again. So I will see you again once I have read probably all of Normal People. Maybe I'll update you halfway. Likely I won't. I've discovered that I don't have to look at my knitting anymore while I knit. I knit this sweater, by the way, if you didn't know. If you didn't know, this is a sweater that I knit myself, and I'm making another one that's going to be better. I can read while knitting. It's kind of slow and tedious for both things. Like I'm not doing both at the quickest pace I could be doing it, but that's how I read Conversations with Friends. It was awesome. I've knit like half a sweater reading a book. So I'm going to go do that. I'll see you after I'm done. So I've done the thing again where I've gone and got a haircut while in the middle of making a video. So there's a very obvious difference in how good I look. I feel like a short haircut takes a couple weeks to settle in. It has not been a couple of weeks. I posted a video that I recorded before the haircut, but posted after I had already got the haircut. And I had never received so many comments in my life telling me how good my hair looks, sitting there with a completely different hairstyle. So I hope the mullet is okay for all of the people that told me that my hair looked good last video. It's gone. Anyway, hello, I'm here to talk to you about Normal People by Sally Rooney. I have finished this. If you don't know, this is a book about, it's a coming-of-age novel. It's about teenagers, they grow into young adults, and they're kind of in this constant on and off relationship. A lot of miscommunication, a lot of unhealthiness surrounding this relationship, but also the idea that they are like perfect for each other in some way. This is a love story. So I have really conflicting feelings on this book, which I will get into after I tell you everything that happens in it. When I started this book, immediately I was so endeared to these characters because I already knew them. I've seen the show. I'm sure I've said that a million fucking times in this video. I have been through an arc with them. So it was just like a completely different experience than reading a book and being introduced to characters for the first time. And I don't read series. Like I can't remember the last time I read a series. So this is like the first experience I've had in recent memory of reading a book where I already knew the characters and I already loved them. And so in the beginning of this, I was smiling, I was kicking my feet, I was so excited to be back in their world with them. And then by the end of the book, I felt differently, but let's talk about what happens in it. So it starts off by introducing us to these two people, Marianne and Connell, and they go to the same high school somewhere in Ireland. Marianne comes from a rich family who is very neglectful, and she is an outcast at their school. Like, everybody hates Marianne, everybody makes fun of Marianne, like she's very much bullied. She's not really upset at being an outcast. She's definitely lonely, but she has a very strong worldview, and that worldview does not allow her to be incredibly affected by the way people perceive her, particularly when she's in high school. And then there's Connell, who comes from a much poorer family than Marianne's, but he has much better social standing. He's like a popular kid, he's a soccer player, he has lots of friends, but he's also this like intellectual, like he's a reader, and he's very misunderstood by his friend group. They are both very, very intelligent people. Connell, particularly in English, he's the top of his class in English, whatever. The two of them know each other because Connell's mom, Lorraine, cleans Marianne's house, her mansion. The two of them only interact in private because Connell really cares about his reputation, and being seen talking to Marianne at all would be so destructive for him. So they only ever talk when he's picking up his mom from her house. And they have this very fun, playful banter with them where they're always like arguing and messing with each other, and like she's always making him blush, and it's very cute. I love the dialogue with them. They have so much chemistry, but it's entirely relegated to this private life. Connell will not be seen with her. He cares so much about what other people think, where Marianne does not buy into like the high school politics bullshit. And I think in the show, I was more annoyed with Connell here. Partly I'm less annoyed with him because I've already been through his character arc, but also I think that this does a much better job of understanding why Connell is like this. Like, it's not simply just high school politics. He doesn't want people to think he's weird. He wants to maintain his good reputation. Like, His reputation and other people's perception of his has a tangible reality for Connell because of his family's perception in the town. It's a very small town. Connell's dad has never been in the picture. Lorraine had Connell when she was a teenager, and her brothers don't have very good reputations. So there is, like, it makes sense why this matters so much to Connell. It is horrible the way he treats Marianne, though. So Connell's living these two lives, each of which is kind of authentic in their own way. I think we are led to believe that he's living his most authentic life in private with Marianne. And he just wants to keep doing this, to keep leading these two lives. He never wants to confront what he's doing and what it means about who he is. There's so much small town and high school politicking going on. It feels so real to high school. Like, oh my god, just the way they are is so fucking high school, and it puts you right back into that headspace. And I loved it because it made me feel like so many emotions just being a high schooler who cares so fucking much. Marianne convinces Connell to apply to study English at Trinity, the university where she's going to study history and politics, and he does. So for a while, it's mostly just Connell and Marianne sneaking around and having a lot of sex. Then there's this bar fundraiser where they're fundraising for the Debs, which is some yearly dance prom type of thing. Marianne has been voted on to the fundraising council, and so she has to go. She was voted on probably as a joke because everybody hates her. So she goes to this bar fundraiser, and we're introduced to some of her classmates who are also fundraising for this dance. Two of them being Karen and Rachel. Karen is like nice. She's kind to Marianne. They dance together. Karen like obviously cares how Marianne feels. They're not friends, but she's a kind person. Then there's Rachel, who is not very kind, and Rachel also is often like flexing how close she is with Connell, alluding to private conversations that they've had. Like she obviously has interest in Connell. When Connell and his friends show up, his friends kind of encourage this older man to grope Marianne and assault her, and he does, and he hurts her, and she runs out crying, of course. And Karen, Rachel, Connell, and then one of Connell's friends all follow her out into the hallway. Karen is kind of comforting her, whereas Rachel is like, it was just a joke. We all thought it was funny. Why are you overreacting? And then Connell, for the first moment ever in this book, puts Marianne first. Despite everyone's shocked reactions, he's looking only at her and asking her if she's okay and if she wants him to take her home. That sounds so nothing. Like, whatever, anyone would do that in this moment, but Marianne is just so outcast from everyone that this is a crazy thing for Connell, who's kind of shy even with his friend group. It's just a crazy thing for him to do. He tells Rachel to fuck off, so it's this big thing where it's just like him and Marianne looking at each other, and they're the only people in the world. And he takes her into his car and he's driving her home, and then they end up going home to his house instead, where I think he tells her that he loves her for the first time. He's not 100% sure if he actually does. He's just like, it felt like the right thing to say in the moment. And then they end up falling asleep in his bed accidentally. She was going to go home that night. And when they wake up, his mom is like jangling her key in the door, and they come downstairs and she catches them in their clothes from the night before. She obviously knows what's going on. Now, Lorraine is the kind of mom that everyone wants, where she treats her child like he is a fully developed human being, but also she's not too much like friendly with him. Like, you know, a parent who's like, you're my best friend, and there's not like this mom-son dynamic. She still has that. She just, I don't know, she's very level-headed. She's got a good head on her shoulders, and she thinks it's very funny that they're sneaking around. She says, you don't need to keep this a secret from me. You know I'm very fond of Marianne, because she knows her from cleaning her house. And then she realizes that Connell is keeping this a secret because of Marianne's status as an outcast, and she's pissed at him for this. Doing all these things in private with Marianne, like having sex with her, she thinks that he is using her, and in a lot of ways he is. Connell ends up inviting Rachel to this yearly dance, the Debs, and when Lorraine finds out, she is so pissed. She instantly says, well, who's Marianne going with? Connell says, I don't know. She says, is Marianne know you're going with Rachel? He says, no, I haven't told her yet. They get into a huge fight about this. She's so angry at him for doing this to Marianne and for just like behaving in a way that she didn't raise him to behave. And Connell also knows that he's done the wrong thing, but he cannot bring himself to care less about what people think. So he goes along with this. He goes to the Debs with Rachel. And when Marianne finds out that he has asked Rachel to the dance, she just drops out of school that day. She never goes back, which you're kind of like, this is really dramatic, but also there is a thing where it's like, this is the last straw for her. And at the same time, that drama, girl, I would have done the exact same thing in high school. If I was in her position, absolutely. If I could just not go to school after something horrible happened to me like that with someone that I had a crush on, I would. It's so real to high school. Then we cut to August, after school has ended, the dance has happened, whatever. And this book does a lot of stuff with the linear nature of the story. It's told like jumping all around, which is not something that the show could really achieve. It like often goes a few months ahead, and so we know where things end up. And then in these like moments of the future, we look back on the past and see how things got to where they ended up. And I thought that that was really well done with this book. So in August, we're with Marianne, and she's like lying out in the garden tanning, and her brother Alan, who's this really shitty guy, is on the phone talking about the exam results. And he says like someone got a perfect score, and she knows it's Connell. And he's talking to Connell on the phone, and then he says to Connell as a joke, knowing his sister's status, do you want to talk to Marianne? And to his surprise, Connell says, yeah, I'll talk to Marianne. But Marianne doesn't want to talk to Connell. So we know they're not on good terms. They just kind of never found each other again after this thing with the dance. Marianne won't respond to his texts or his calls. She won't let him into her house, and Lorraine says to Marianne, like, I have half a mind to kick him out of my house. Like, Lorraine is so fucking pissed at her son. And then we cut to Connell in university at Trinity, and he is debilitatingly shy. He doesn't know anybody, and he sees himself as like intellectually and financially inferior to everybody around him. And we're cutting to him at this party at Gareth's house, which is a guy he kind of knows. And he's at this party, and he's feeling so isolated and so anxious and so different. And Gareth says, let me introduce you to my girlfriend, Marianne. Marianne has blossomed. She's happy. She has friends. People obviously like her and care about what she has to say. And they see each other, and she like takes him into the kitchen to get him a drink, and they're alone in the kitchen. And it's the first time that they've seen each other since she had left school. She asks him about Rachel, kind of assuming, I think, that they are dating. And he says, oh no, Rachel and I didn't last. Like, we hardly even dated at all. I just took her to the dance, and then she broke it off with me. And he reminisces on that time in his life where Marianne had dropped out of school. He was not able to like keep up appearances during this time. He was just so depressed and so upset with himself for doing this to Marianne and being this kind of person that he wasn't like interacting with his friends. He would just sit there in silence, like staring off into space. And everyone noticed, but he couldn't make himself care about them noticing. So while Connell is thinking back on these past few months without Marianne, it gets to my favorite part of the book, where he's thinking about what happened at the Debs. He was depressed. He couldn't handle the socializing. He couldn't do it. So he went outside to have a cigarette, and when he goes outside, his friend Eric comes out with him, and Eric says, so what happened with Marianne? And Connell obviously plays it cool. He's like, I don't know what you're talking about. Eric says, we know you were together. Like, everybody knows. And this is the worst thing Eric could have said, not because it ruined Connell's life, but because it didn't. Because this thing that he had been hiding, this thing that he felt like he had destroyed this relationship over, thinking that everybody would care so much, actually didn't matter. He had got so in his head about it with this paranoia, and it would have been okay. Everybody knew anyway, this thing that he was trying to hide. That is my favorite fucking trope. Oh my god, devastating. He knew then that the secret for which he had sacrificed his own happiness and the happiness of another person had been trivial all along and worthless. I had to put the book down. I had to walk away from it. Oh my god, love it. I love what you did there, Sally Rooney. That was fucking great. Back in the kitchen at this party, Marianne and Connell are bantering. She says that she has friends that she could introduce him to, and he's kind of welcomed into her social circle. Then we cut to the future again, where Marianne gets fucked up at a party, and she tries to kiss Connell, who is sober. And he pushes her away and says, no, I'm not going to kiss you. But the next morning he drives her home, and then they have sex with each other for the first time in like a year. And this kicks off their second attempt at being a couple. Connell is not like keeping this a secret from everybody, but he won't touch Marianne in front of anyone. He still has a lot of reservations about that. And he can also see how he and his actions have affected Marianne's self-esteem, and he hates himself for it. But that doesn't mean that he changes. Then we cut months to the future, where they see each other at a grocery store in their hometown, and she doesn't want to see him, and it's very awkward. So again, we're in this spot where we know things have gone wrong. And this is a point where I wished that I hadn't seen the show. Like, I know what has happened. The show is basically an incredibly faithful, like, one-to-one replication of the book. So I knew what had gone on in this period where we cut from them being together to them being really awkward and obviously no longer together. I think that would have been a lot more fun to figure out as I was reading the book. But whatever, it's fine. I still think there were things that were really good about me having watched the show first, and things that I didn't love. It was a balance. We learned that over the summer, Marianne stayed in Dublin, but Connell ran out of money and he had to move home, and he told Marianne that he wanted to see other people. So Marianne starts dating this guy, Jamie, who's a little shit. He's ultra wealthy. He's the most irritating character of all time. She's really seeing him because of her low self-esteem. Now, Connell remembers this breakup very differently. He had lost his job, and he spent weeks trying to build up the courage to ask Marianne if he could stay with her. He knew that she was going to say yes. He basically lived at her house anyway, but there's this like financial dynamic, like this class dynamic between them where he felt so uncomfortable kind of in a way asking her for money. So he just couldn't do it. Like he just couldn't bring himself to outright ask her if he could stay with her for the summer. So it gets to this like really awkward conversation where Connell half brings it up, I think hoping that Marianne will offer. So real. Like who has not been there when you don't want to ask for something and you're just hoping you can just kind of sneak it in, but obviously it doesn't work because communication doesn't work like that. And Connell is the worst fucking communicator of all time. So Marianne doesn't catch on, and Connell over the conversation feels that he's just like lost track of it and he has lost his chance to ask her. And so he gets really sad and he says like, oh, woe is me. He's like, you'll probably want to see other people. So they both remember this conversation so differently. He went in with the intention to ask her to live together, and she thinks he's breaking up with her. After the summer, when they're back at school, Connell is still part of Marianne's friend group. There's a distance between the two of them, of course, and Connell feels this huge class dynamic with Jamie and Marianne's relationship because they are of a much more similar socioeconomic standing, whereas Connell feels inferior. But also, in a lot of ways, superior because Jamie is the worst fucking guy ever. I can't even explain how much I hate him. So Connell and Marianne see each other sometimes, but he's not as much in her life as he has been in the past, even when they weren't dating, while she's with this guy, Jamie. One night, Marianne's having her friends over, and Connell calls her so drunk, like fucked out of his mind, and he has been mugged and hers is the only number that he knows. So he comes over to her house. He's got a busted lip, he's so drunk, and he needs to borrow some money from her because his wallet has been stolen. And she kind of just like dismisses all of her friends, and her and Connell sit there and talk, and he tells her that he has been seeing this woman, Helen, and Marianne involuntarily starts crying, which is of course so embarrassing. She basically says like, please just leave. She's humiliated that she's crying, and she's jealous and upset that Connell is seeing someone else, even though she does have a boyfriend. And before Connell leaves, he says, I don't really know what happened to us. And they kind of hash out this miscommunication. When he says like, I wanted to live with you, Marianne is shocked. Like her hand goes to her throat. She's like, oh my God, I thought you were breaking up with me. She says, of course you could have stayed here. I love you. I wanted you to be here. I thought that was you ending our relationship. Devastating. Then we cut months later to a backpacking trip that Connell is taking with his roommate and like another friend of his. At this point, he's still seeing this woman, Helen, and he is going to meet up with Marianne in Italy, where she's staying at her parents' vacation home. Incredibly reminiscent of conversations with friends. And we cut back and we learn that Connell is able to go on this backpacking trip because he got this huge scholarship for being a very good student. Something in Ireland, I'm sorry, I don't know the intricacies of it, but he got this scholarship, as did Marianne. Both of them are still very smart, do very well in school, and they're both being rewarded for it. It's obviously very different for Connell than it is for Marianne. I mean, Marianne did this more as like a self-esteem thing, I guess, or like to be recognized for being intelligent, whereas Connell needed the money. Marianne didn't need the money. So they're staying in this beautiful house in Italy. They have lunch the day that Connell and his friends arrive, and while they're having lunch, I'll give you an example of why we hate Jamie so much. Jamie is like, these aren't champagne glasses. Can't we drink out of a champagne glass if we're drinking champagne? And they're like, Jamie, these are champagne glasses. You're thinking of a champagne flute. And he's like, I'm not going to drink out of this. He's such a little shit. And he's also wrong, but he thinks he's like so smart and so much better than everybody else, and he won't accept that he's wrong. It's so real. It's such a realistic portrayal of like the worst guy you've ever met. And there's kind of this tension building between Jamie and Marianne, which culminates in a big fight at dinner that night that Connell gets there, where Jamie is like telling her to go get the cream, like just bossing her around, treating her like she's stupid and worthless. And they go and start fighting in the kitchen while everyone else is outside. Connell hears a shriek and he comes in. Jamie is like drunk and he's holding a wine glass. He's sloshing it all over the place. Marianne says, put that down. And Jamie just drops it and it shatters all over the floor. And she starts screaming and like lunging at him. And Connell whisks her away, takes her outside. She ends up sleeping in Connell's room that night, where she cries and she opens up to him about the abuse that she's faced in her family, which she's kind of mentioned before, but she's only ever really talked about her father, who is dead, not the like active abuse she's faced while the two of them have known each other. And then Connell initiates sex, like they start making out and she rejects him and she turns away, and it's so awkward and so horrible. Connell, I don't know. The way he treats Marianne, it gets old. You get a little bit tired of it. Then we cut to when Marianne is spending the next year abroad in Sweden, and she is experiencing this kind of depression. Both characters experience a pretty intense depression in different ways, which I really liked the way Sally Rooney did. Marianne is feeling very isolated, and she also wants to be mistreated by men. There's this photographer, Lucas, who she is having sex with, and they're doing a lot of like BDSM type of stuff where he treats her like shit, basically. And he is photographing her naked, and he's doing this like domination thing, and then he says, "I love you," and that just like kicks her into high gear. She gets out of there because she's so disgusted that he could think that the way he treats her, which she knows is horrible and yet still desires, he is conflating that with love. It just absolutely disgusts her. Then we go back to Connell. This book mostly follows Connell, and Connell is going to a therapy session because he, like I said, is experiencing a really like potent depression. And in this therapy session, we are going back and forth in time, learning how Connell has got to this place. It kind of all kicked off because his friend from high school, Rob, had killed himself, and this just sent the depression spiraling. Helen ends up breaking up with him. They go home for Rob's funeral, and Connell just like won't introduce Helen to anyone. He won't really interact with anyone. Like, he treats her like he doesn't want her to be there, and she just like can't handle it. A couple of weeks later, she breaks it off with him, and he can't even like summon up emotions to feel about the end of this like quite long relationship. He's just devastatingly empty, and he can't bring himself to do things. Like, there's this story where he can't make it from the ensuite to his bed, so he just lies on the floor for hours and thinks about how he just wants to like lie there and starve or dehydrate to death. Then we cut again to the next summer where him and Marianne are hanging out every weekend in their hometown. Marianne's living there for the summer. Connell is just coming back to see her every weekend, and they're not in a relationship, but they are still very, very close friends, and neither of them wants to mess it up with the other. The day that we cut to, they have sex again, but it ends in awkwardness. There's so much pressure and so much like just wanting to do it right and it never having gone right in the past. And then of course there's so much miscommunication between them. Always. They are never communicating well. Marianne ends up running out of the house and going home. She knows she's acting childish, and she gets home and her brother Alan is like, "Where the fuck have you been?" And they get into this argument. Alan is just a shithead abusive guy. I mean, this is kind of the basis of why Marianne seeks this treatment out from men in like romantic relationships, because of how men have treated her all of her life. And Alan, we know, is part of the core of that. And Alan ends up slamming a door into her face, and she thinks she's broken her nose. So she calls Connell up, and Connell comes over to her house, and then he says, "Did Alan do this to you?" And he threatens to kill Alan, and he says to Marianne, "I'm never going to let anybody do anything like that to you again." At this point, it has just become so, like, achingly, like, almost oppressively heterosexual. I was like, okay, okay, look at you, you're a big tough guy, Connell. I don't know, it was irritating. I can't imagine him doing anything else, but I was just like, whatever. Then we cut again a few months later, and they are together. They're in this happy relationship. Think they're living together, and Marianne is estranged from her family. She goes home to Connell's family for Christmas. It's very sweet, and they're both very happy. Then all of a sudden, kind of randomly, Connell gets into this MFA, like creative writing program in New York. This is the end of the book. This was something that I really didn't like the way the show did. It felt like it came out of nowhere. It felt like they never focused on Connell's aspirations to write and his love of writing and how it like affects his life. That was much more present in the book. This was definitely set up more, but I still think that this ending was very rushed. He gets into this program and Marianne says, "You should go and do it. I won't come with you, but I'll be here when you get back." And then they get into a fight because he never told her that he was applying, but he did tell this other girl who he's not interested in, but Marianne is like jealous and insecure about. But they recover pretty quickly from that fight, which does show growth. Usually when they get into an argument or there's a miscommunication, somebody just leaves. Like, they just walk away. They just give up on trying to communicate. So that is kind of nice, but the book ends with Marianne telling Connell, "Go to New York. I'll be here when you get back." And that's it. Not a satisfying ending. Not a nice ending. I think Sally Rooney likes to do that. I think she likes to make her characters happy and then right at the very end just pull the rug out from underneath of them. that's the experience I've had with both books I've read from her so far. I do love a book centering around miscommunication, and I think this book does it well, except at the end, like by the time you're through these 300 pages, you are tired of it. Like, it just gets frustrating. Like I said, I started out loving these characters, loving the dialogue, absolutely adoring following them around. Like, it was making me feel so much. I was like, the whole time I was reading it, it was hard for me to read because every time I was just like so overcome with emotion about them. As it goes through, that emotion like turned into ire and wrath. Oh my God, by the end of it, I was like so fucking done with Connell. Just try a bit harder to communicate. And none of this ever would have happened. My eye is twitching. I'm like so irritated with him. Something I think is handled really well with the theme of miscommunication in Normal People is Sally Rooney's focus on gesture and like communication through body language and how unreliable that can be. I think it really puts a lot of weight on how the characters are perceiving others and perceiving the communication that is happening and how it is not always aligned with the intention. And once you notice this focus on gesture, you will not be able to unsee it. Like, she's always saying someone picks up a coffee cup, someone holds a coffee cup to their mouth, someone's holding a cigarette. I'm saying that like it annoyed me, but I actually found it to be a really effective storytelling technique. Something that I liked in both books is how Rooney gets into the characters' worldviews. Like, they are often in dialogue talking about what they think about the world that they live in and what their political opinions are. And I like that she can do that often without like favoring one side or it being very clear who she agrees with. Like, it sometimes feels like she herself is hashing out her own beliefs and like two different sides in her own brain because of the way that she treats them with equality, I guess. I guess that's really to say that the characters here are very well thought out. That's what Sally Rooney is doing best. She is characterizing and dialogue. Her dialogue is great. It's so charming. And what I really liked about this, a lot more than Conversations with Friends, is how Irish it is. This is very much specifically set in Ireland. Whereas Conversations with Friends, it is set in Ireland technically, but really it could be set in essentially any city in the global north. It's very much not specific to a time or a place, whereas Normal People definitely is. And specifically, the language that they use is Irish in Normal People, whereas Conversations with Friends, almost all of it could be Americans speaking, or British people, or whatever. There's like a few characters that speak with an Irish affect in Conversations with Friends, whereas everyone in Normal People does, and I find that a lot more fun to read. And also, this book is very much specifically set in a time. Every chapter tells you what year it is, which I don't think is the case for Conversations with Friends. So that was done very well here. It felt like maybe her editors or her agent had told her to make a more like worldwide accessible book, like a book that Americans will read with her first book, and then she kind of strayed from that here, and it made it a lot better. Something that I really didn't love by the end of this book was Marianne's relationship with sex and desire and self-worth and submission and domination. It felt very half-baked, and it also felt, because we don't get much from Marianne's perspective, this is a book that mostly follows Connell, that I kind of just felt icky by the end. I felt like I needed to hear more from her about how she felt and what she thought about this, and the times that I did, it didn't feel all that deep or well developed. And along with that whole sex aspect, while I liked that this book explored the worst parts of these two characters unwaveringly, it did feel like Connell was meant to be seen as someone who was like perfectly compatible with Marianne, specifically because of their like sexual dynamic. Like, there was this idea of divine partnership, like they are made for each other, that's only ever really explored through the way that they have sex. And that is partly because, in the beginning at least, their relationship is almost entirely sexual. They're not dating, like they won't be seen together. So that does make sense in some ways, but I think that Connell, despite his flaws, was intended to be seen as better than the other men in Marianne's life, and this idea of divine partnership kind of justified the way that he treated her and why she kept going back to him. By the end of it, I thought that it was really starting to get into stuff that the book itself was not prepared to handle with a lot of depth, and I think that Marianne's character had a lot of untapped potential that would, I think for me, have fixed a lot of these issues that I had with it. At the beginning, this book was a 5-star, and by the end, it was like 3. I was just frustrated. Like, oh my God, just communicate. Just do something else. I think people complain a lot about the whole like, oh, miscommunication happened, I'm just gonna leave. I'm just walking away instead of trying to fix it. I kind of liked it. I found that to be relatable. Sometimes I'm overwhelmed. Sometimes I'm like, you know what? Anything I say right now, I'm not going to be able to communicate my intention. And so I'm just going to walk away and leave it where it is so it doesn't get worse. That felt real to me. I have considered that it might be the case that I like it so much more when they're in high school because I am a lot farther away from high school than I am from them when they're at the end of the book and they're my age. That could definitely be at play here. Like, it's a lot easier to reflect on yourself and relate your older self to these characters than it is when they feel very close to you. Because like I said, it really does get into their shittiness and how they can treat other people and how they see the world in these flawed ways. And sometimes that's hard to reflect on with your current self. If you haven't read the book because you've seen the show, I think you should, even though maybe you won't love it by the end of it. The beginning is so good for someone who's seen the show. Oh my god, I could not get over it. So I think at the end of the day, I would still recommend it. But it wasn't my favorite. Like, I left conversations with friends feeling a lot better than I did with normal people. Next up, I am going to read Beautiful World, Where Are You?, which is a book I've not ever heard a good thing about. I'm not, like, insanely negative, but I think this is her least liked book. And honestly, at this point, 2 books in, I'm feeling pretty oversaturated with the Sally Rooney. I feel, okay, we're reading Sally Rooney. I don't know why I thought this was a good idea. I have, from what I've heard, think that intermezzo is going to be a little bit different. Probably still pretty similar, but I'm excited to get to that at the end. This one might be a bit of a slog. I'll see you when I'm somewhere in it. Hello, I'm here to talk to you about Sally Rooney's 3rd novel, Beautiful World, Where Are You?, which I just finished like 15 minutes ago. This book starts out by introducing us to Alice and Felix, who are a couple of people that are meeting for the first time after connecting on Tinder, and they're meeting at this bar, and we're kind of getting to know them. But I think in this book, the first impressions that you get of every character are a little bit wrong. I don't know, I just felt like it didn't quite match up over the course of the book, and I think that that was intended. Neither of them seem very warm or friendly. They're both a little bit strange in their interactions, and there's not very much chemistry or charisma between the two of them. Alice is a little bit cold and distant, whereas Felix seems quite standoffish. We learn that Alice has just moved to this small town where Felix has always lived from the big city. The two of them go back to Alice's place together, even though, again, there's not much chemistry there, and she's living in this huge mansion all by herself. And the date ends kind of awkwardly. She takes Felix over, and he ends up leaving, and they both think, like, oof. Chapter 2 is a long email from Alice to another character, Eileen, and it's mostly talking about like social and political issues and her worldview and what she thinks about what's happening around her. The next chapter, we are introduced to Eileen and Simon, who meet up sort of for lunch. They're flirting with each other a lot, like it's incredibly flirtatious, a lot of banter, but they're obviously not together. The two of them are old friends from primary school, and they are kind of preparing for Eileen's sister Lola's upcoming wedding. Eileen is yet another anxious, outcast, sort of creative type, writerly person. Alice also fits into this, but she's less anxious and more like having in the midst of a breakdown all the time. These characters are reminiscent, or maybe you could even say redundant at this point. I'm used to them. This is exactly how I'm expecting Sally Rooney to write her leading women. She's not doing anything shocking or new here with her characters. Here we're kind of establishing the relationships between the rest of the cast of characters. Eileen and Alice are very good friends from university. They used to live together, and then Eileen and Simon know each other from growing up, and Simon and Alice are also friends through Eileen. Eileen is 5 or 6 years younger than Simon, and she, when she was like 15 and he was 20, had this massive, overbearing crush on him. Simon is this polite, good-mannered Catholic boy, and they have had a fling, but they have never actually like been together. But it's kind of there's always been a little bit of a thing between the two of them, which is kind of gross when you think about the 15 and 20-year-olds, but they are fully consenting adults now, and the book doesn't get into their youth too much. We're also getting a little bit of history about these people. Alice had got this huge publishing deal. She's like this big famous writer, and she moved to New York, and then she got really depressed, and she ignored everybody, and then she ended up in the psychiatric hospital. And Eileen is just coming out of a long-term relationship with who she thought was her life partner, Aiden. She's quite caught up on him in the beginning of this book. When we go back to Alice and Felix's perspective, they see each other in the grocery store after their awkward date. Something similar happens in Normal People. She's revisiting a lot of the same stuff in her books. That's okay. It is my fault for reading them all in order like this. I'm just noticing like a lot of similarities. We're hitting a lot of the same points. Felix ends up inviting Alice to a party at his place, and at this party she meets his friends, and then she invites him to go with her to Rome for some publishing thing that she has to do, and he agrees. They have seen each other literally twice, and they don't even seem to like each other all that much. Eileen and Simon then have some pretty intense role-playing phone sex. We know Simon is non-exclusively seeing a much younger woman. She's like 23. He is like 35. I wish just a little bit that we got into Simon and that, because he's portrayed, honestly, through the whole thing as a really good guy. Like, there's complexities for sure. He's not like the best person. He's like quite emotionally cold. He's not the best person as a partner, but there's a grossness to him that I think is left unexplored here. After Eileen goes to a birthday party and gets really drunk with some friends and coworkers, she then shows up at Simon's house in the middle of the night, and they have sex for the first time in many years. And then the next morning they go to mass together. He's Catholic, and this is kind of a life-changing experience for Eileen. It doesn't convert her, but she kind of realizes how in love with Simon she really is. I think this book engages with religion in a really interesting way. Simon is the only religious character, so we're mostly engaging with it from an outsider's perspective, but from a neutral outsider's perspective, which I think is really singular and unique. While Felix and Alice are in Rome, the shower in their hotel breaks, and so he hands his phone to her, asking her to look up the make and model of the shower as he reads it out. And when he hands it to her, it's open to a porn page where he's watching some pretty degrading stuff. Nothing like crazy, over the top, transgressive or anything like that, but just like a little bit weird, and it definitely makes Alice uncomfortable. They end up getting into an argument. He says like, you don't need to make me feel guilty about this. They fight, and she kind of confesses that she is actually really into him, and he likes this dynamic of her seeming to be a lot more into him than he is into her. But there is more to it than that. Like, there's a bit of a complexity there where Alice is letting him believe that she's like under his thumb, and she isn't really. Like, he can't actually get that close to her. But up until this point, this argument, they've really just been acquaintances. Like, they haven't even touched each other, and this kind of kicks off more of a relationship between the two of them. Then we go back to Eileen and Simon, who go to a party with their mutual friends together. They're like very, very entangled in each other's lives. Like, they have a very similar friend group. While there, a woman who is closer friends with Simon introduces Eileen to Simon, not knowing that they're close. And then other things happen at the party. Like, their mutual friends talk about this much younger woman that he's seeing, and they talk about her like positively, and they say that she's a great gal. And Eileen is kind of tortured by the fact that nobody knows how close her and Simon really are, and that Simon has kept her away from his younger girlfriend. Like, she feels left out, like she's the only one who doesn't know her. She gets upset and she leaves the party, and he walks her home, and they get into a big argument where she breaks it off with him, and they're both very upset. I really liked this moment after she comes home from this argument with him, and she's texting him, and she says like, I fucking hate you so much, and then she erases it and she says, I'm so sorry, I'm the worst person ever. And she's just so full of emotion, and she wants to kind of like ruin things with him here even more than they already are. Then we go back to the Felix and Alice storyline. Felix knows that Alice is really into him, so he's not trying to be a good partner to her. Like, they have dinner plans, and he says, sorry, I'm actually going out with the boys tonight. He gets plastered. He shows up at her door wanting sex. He's like, I don't even have to try at all. She'll want me no matter what I do. I'm not saying it's Alice's fault. I think that was kind of how that just came across. I'm just saying that's the way he's arrived at this, and it's shitty. But at the same time, there is something that I find quite charming about Felix. I don't think that he's a good guy or anything like that. I enjoyed his dialogue. He is like a very typical kind of working class Irish man. He works at a warehouse, he does this manual labor job, and he has a very nuanced relationship with masculinity, because he is also just like very casually bisexual, and like he speaks like a man, and he interacts with the world like a man in this very masculine way. He talks to women and men in a very like way that is in a way that's very influenced by his gender, but then he also is not all that tied to the confines of masculinity. Like, he'll wear mascara and just be like, whatever, so what? I enjoyed it. I think in books where even if there's gay people, Sally Rooney writes everyone to be like achingly heterosexual, I think she did a good job with Felix's character and his relationship with masculinity. And I loved that for the first time, I feel like I'm reading a character written by Sally Rooney that is not some tortured fucking artist. And that made Felix a lot more interesting to me, just because I'm reading these books all like one after the other. I'm tired of the fucking tortured artists. Finally, near the end of the book, Simon and Eileen, who are broken up at this point, go and visit Alice and Felix. And this is kind of what the book's been building up to. They've been planning this over emails. I really enjoyed here Simon and Felix's conversations as they're getting to know each other. They're talking in, you know, a very man kind of way, like chatting, but there's also this tenderness to it that I found really enjoyable. I loved the dynamic that was developing between them, particularly because Felix has this kind of tactless but earnest interest in the people around him, and he almost interviews them. Like, he just wants to know everything, and he asks so many questions, and Simon is so good-natured that he answers most of them. It creates this really fun dynamic between the two of them. The book ends up culminating in a big fight because Eileen is upset that Alice has kind of kept her at arm's length for a while. She finds out that Alice is planning on buying this house that she's renting in this town and like leaving her forever. And she's, of course, incredibly upset at this, and she feels that she's the last person to find out. The same way she was the last person to find out when Alice had a mental breakdown and was hospitalized, and the last person to meet Simon's girlfriend. She just feels like all the people that she loves don't love her as much as she loves them, and they're all keeping her at a distance. So Eileen and Alice fight, and then Eileen storms off, and Simon, of course, follows her, not before Alice gets some digs in at him when he says, like, you don't really mean this, like, you're just trying to be hurtful. He goes upstairs, and him and Eileen talk about their relationship and how they've been pining after each other, like, both going for it and then not going for it for so many years, how Simon wants her so badly, but she just kind of in some ways wants to be friends because she's so worried about them getting together and then it not working out, and then they're not friends anymore. Relatable as someone who is currently in a loving relationship with a partner who I was best friends with for 10 years. That shit is scary. I think the paranoia and fear here is really grounded in reality, but that doesn't mean that it isn't hurting both her and Simon. Back downstairs, Alice kind of just breaks down. She drops a wine glass on purpose. Felix says, if you're planning on hurting yourself, you shouldn't. It's not going to help you and you're just going to feel worse afterwards. She is like kind of threatening to end her life, and Felix is treating her, I don't know, I think that this is his shining moment in the book where he is acting so level-headed and logical, but also with a tenderness and a like responsivity to her emotions. He just like handles the situation so well, speaking to her as an equal. I don't know, it really worked for me. It was as if he knew exactly what she needed in that moment, and it wasn't this thing where he was just like comforting her and patting her on the back. Like, he was just treating her like a normal human being, even when she was acting quite abnormal. And she tries to fight with him here, and he basically doesn't let her. He just says, like, I'm not doing this with you, whatever. The book ends with 2 final letters. The first one being from Alice, and she's talking about the fucking pandemic. For no reason, this book ends on a pandemic note. Oh my god. Ugh. Rolled my eyes. I hate that. I don't need to hear about COVID in my books, even if it's just a little addendum at the end. There's no reason. Like, it had no impact on the story. This is the last 10 pages. You did not need to introduce the goddamn pandemic. We learn in this letter that everyone has ended up with each other. Alice and Felix are happy. Eileen and Simon are happy. Eileen writes back the final email of the book, and she says that her and Simon are pregnant. So the book ends on this hopeful note of this pregnancy with Eileen and Simon, but it's not like entirely cheapening the story or betraying the characters it has set out so far. Eileen is talking about how she's nervous and what she thinks about her pregnancy in relationship to the climate and like the collapse of civilization, and does she want to bring a child into this world, and in relationship to like other mothers and other children. It's very interesting, and it's very self-aware and politically aware and socially aware, which is kind of the crux of these emails that take up almost half the book. I found these emails to be a little bit pretentious, and sometimes they're quite boring as these kind of long monologues. They're very personal to the characters, but they're not interpersonal. There's no establishing a dynamic between Alice and Eileen, which I think was in some ways intended. When they meet up near the end of the book, they kind of talk about how they don't really remember their own dynamic, and they're a bit shy with each other. So I kind of get why we don't have that established for us, but I think that it just makes it sort of unsatisfying when they're finally interacting. Like, you feel like you don't really know them. And that was my main problem with this book, was I think that It doesn't have the Sally Rooney thing of like really, really, really well developed characters. It focused more on what was happening in the romantic relationships and less on like robust character development, which kind of sucked. Mostly, I just think that's what she does the best, and it wasn't done very well in this. I also think the other thing she does the best is dialogue, and the dialogue was quite different here and not as charming as I found it in her other works. Another difference here is the authorial voice. It was a lot more blunt and to the point, almost reading like a screenplay, like it was like this and then this and then this and then this. Very short sentences. This voice also can't decide if it's omniscient or not, sometimes seeming to get into characters' heads and then often saying like, this character seemed to do this, or this character did a thing that suggested this, and I didn't love that. I felt like it was not as intimate as it typically is in a Rooney book. In this book, I mean, in all of her books so far, sex has been very central, but in this book, it's described in a lot more vivid physical detail, which I personally found a little bit dull. I don't love reading a sex scene anyway, but with this weird perspective, I didn't find myself feeling like I knew the characters all that well, and so I didn't really care about what happened when they had sex. It was kind of boring to me, and there's also this thing in this book of these, like, chunks of text, like blocks of text. There's not very many paragraph breaks, and I found that to be a little bit tiring with the sex scenes particularly. Another thing that drove me further from the characters was this alternating perspectives thing, where it alternated perspectives and then also in between that was alternating these emails back and forth. I think this made this book not have a very good sense of like scale time-wise, so I didn't really feel as connected to the story, like knowing how quickly this was taking place, even though I think it does try to let you know, saying like the following day, but at that point, the time that we heard about yesterday was like 2-3 chapters ago. This book overall has very little plot, and I didn't feel that connected to the characters, and yet somehow I was very invested in reading it. I read this over 2 days. I was kind of excited to pick it up, even though it didn't really have the things that I like in a Rooney novel and the things that I like just in a novel in general. It's certainly her weakest work so far, but I still found it to be very enjoyable, which I think is kind of a testament to her skill with writing. I hated a lot of things about this book. Like, I honestly don't think there were that many things I've said that were positive here, but I liked reading it, whatever that means. I'm actually going to correct that. I didn't hate a lot of things about this book. There were just things that I didn't like all that much. I didn't honestly feel as irritated with this book as I did by the end of Normal People, so that might be part of my enjoyment with it. But I am finally moving on to the last book in the Rooneyverse, Intermezzo. I haven't really started this yet. I opened it and noticed that it has a very similar authorial voice to Beautiful World, Where Are You? And I figured I should sit down and talk about the other one so I don't get them confused. This copy that I have is a misprint, which I kind of love. The spine is printed upside down. I'm gonna go get started on that, and I will see you at some point. Probably when I'm finished with it. Sorry. Hello, I'm here to give you a little bit of an update on Intermezzo. I'm like 150 pages from the end of this book, and I'm recording this because I need some sort of motivation to get me through this last quarter of it. I'm done. I'm just so fucking bored by this book. I really don't think this is a bad book. I understand why people like it. I'm just so fucking bored by it. There's no plot. I've read so many Sally Rooney books in the last week, and they just have less and less plot as we go along, and I want something with plot. So this is not working for me at the moment. So I'm just going to get some of my thoughts out, tell you what's happened so far. Again, like, there's not really plot, so I don't have all that much to say, and hopefully I will be able to finish this book today, and then record the final section of this video, and then never think about Sally Rooney again. I'm sorry, I don't hate Sally Rooney. I'm just really, really bored right now. I think that she's a good writer, and I will read anything else she publishes. Not like all in a row like this, though. This was not the right choice. Oh, I literally have no notes. This is my intermezzo notes, and then for the same amount of pages, that up to there. Okay, so that's actually not that much. So Intermezzo is a book with alternating perspectives following two brothers who have just lost their father to like a 5-year-long battle with cancer. We start with Peter, who is like 10 years older. He's a lawyer. He's very detached from his life. He's very depressed. He's also like a sugar daddy to a 23-year-old college student. and he is dealing with this breakup from his kind of life partner, Sylvia, who broke up with him after she got into an accident that has incredibly impacted her life. Now, the voice for Peter's section, this is not told in first person, but it has two very different, distinct voices. Peter's sections are this very choppy, like efficient kind of prose that I really don't like. It's sort of a stream of consciousness thing, which is never my favorite, and I find that it does not have very good flow. It kind of reminds me of Emer McBride, who wrote one of my least favorite books that I've ever read. This is not in gibberish, but it's sort of like if Emer McBride wrote in English, that would be Peter's sections in intermezzo. And then there's Ivan, who is a 23-year-old socially inept chess genius. He doesn't really understand social conventions. He feels like everybody gets something that he doesn't get. Like there's this inherent thing that everyone understands with like social relationships that he's just on the outside of. I've written in my notes, he's just like me for real if I was intelligent. And now that I'm later into the book, I do feel like I should reflect on that, because as we learn more about Peter, we figure out that he does not treat women the best, or it's actually not that. He treats women well. He treats women better than Peter does, but he has very backwards ideas about women and men and the relationships between them, whereas Peter kind of like sets himself out to be this feminist and then treats all the women in his life like shit. So that's really interesting. I think it's just maybe I need to reflect on my opinions about women, because I have written that I'm just like Ivan. So Ivan does this chess tournament at some art center in a small town where he plays 10 different people at once, and he wins all the chess games because he's a chess genius. And he meets this woman there, Margaret. She works for this venue. And we're kind of getting both Ivan and Margaret's perspective here, and they really like each other. And we know that Margaret really likes him and feels that they're in the same camp. Like, they're both different together. And Margaret is 36, I think. She's like 10 years older than him. Peter ends up inviting her back to the place that he's staying while he's in this town, and she goes with him, and they have sex, and it's wonderful for them. And with Peter's perspective, he's living this very depressed life. He's often Googling, like, am I insane? How to tell if I'm insane? Which is so funny because he doesn't really seem to act like an insane person or think like an insane person. It's just like this anxiety that he might be going crazy. That's very relatable. I definitely am dreading Peter's chapters because I really don't like the way that they're written. Not that they're written poorly, it's just really, really not my style. Peter kind of falls into this platonic life partnership with Sylvia. They're still very tightly in each other's lives, but he's like spending every night at her house. They have dinner together. They are like truly life partners. They just can't have penetrative sex because of Sylvia's injuries. One night he's kind of like coming on to her, like grabbing at her, sort of just like pawing at her, and she is into it for a while. Then she says like, do you want me to like touch you? And he's like, yes. And then she gets really upset. I'm paraphrasing and really like simplifying this. They get into an argument and she's upset because she doesn't want to have some sort of like what she sees as not going all the way, like half-baked sex with him. She wants to be like fully with him and she can't. So instead she'd rather he remembered her as she was before the accident. Then we go back to Ivan and Margaret. Ivan had given Margaret his phone number and just said, if you ever think of me, just call me. But he kind of thinks that she's never going to call him, and she also thinks that she's never going to call him. They have a large age gap and like life experience gap between them, but she does end up calling him, and he goes and takes the train and he stays with her, and of course they have a lot of sex. We learn that Margaret is dealing with fallout from a pretty nasty divorce, that she still is technically married to this guy Ricky, who is an alcoholic and really has impacted her life a lot, and no one really believes how much he's impacted her life. He also is like kind of following her around, like calling her work relentlessly, showing up at her work, wanting to get back together with her. And she doesn't really have many people on her side in her life. Her mother is a character who thinks that she never should have married him in the first place, and now that she has, she should have stayed with him. She has this best friend, Anna, who I love, and we get like little glimpses of their relationship that's really wonderful. I do really like the way Sally Rooney writes the friendships between women. She just doesn't do it often. Back with Peter and Naomi. Naomi is evicted because she's living in this like illegal university house, and she ends up being arrested during this eviction. And Peter's a lawyer. He's like a human rights lawyer, not really related to this, but you know, he knows somewhat of the legal system. He goes and picks her up, and she begins to stay with him, and he and Sylvia have gotten this fight, so he just kind of doesn't go over to Sylvia's place anymore, and he's living with this 23-year-old college student who is like an online sex worker, and he is part of her sex work. Like, he's financially supporting her. He's always been this like sugar daddy figure to her, but now they're kind of more in like a domestic relationship. So the two brothers are not very close. They have kind of always had this tense relationship between the two of them. They bicker and fight about everything. They both are driven by this need to win and this need to be right, and they're both very stubborn. But, you know, they're trying to come together somewhat in the grief over their father, who Ivan was a lot closer to than Peter, but who they're both grieving the loss of this man. So they have this dinner together, and Peter finds out that Ivan is seeing a woman, and he's shocked that this woman isn't also really into chess, because he thinks that no one could really be interested in Ivan, because he is so weird and such a social outcast, and so just like incompetent with like talking and being around people. He's always like questioning whether he's saying the right thing and then never really getting to the right thing. He is just like me, but also I do respect women more than Ivan does. I hope. During this conversation, Ivan kind of just like randomly, tactlessly drops the information that Margaret is 36 years old and recovering from this divorce that she's just recently had. And Peter reacts not well to this. He says, "Oh my God, she's double your age. She's nearly 40. Why would a woman her age want to be with a man like you? She can't be normal." So it ends in this huge fight where Ivan gets up from the table and he says, "I hate you. I've always hated you." And he blocks Peter's number. There is certainly such a sense of irony here with Peter being like taking advantage of this vulnerable young woman who is Ivan's age. Like, it's the same age gap. Not only is it the same age gap, but it's a very different power gap, because Peter is like financially and like physically housing Naomi. Margaret's not doing any of that. Throughout the book, Ivan and Peter's mom, who left when Ivan was like 6, she's not a very kind woman, and she much prefers her new family to her old one. She has been housing Ivan's dog, who used to live with his dead father, and she's been saying, "I'm not a shelter. You got to find a place for this dog." Ivan lives in like university housing, like he's renting. He can't take care of this dog. So this whole time have been thinking Margaret's going to take the dog for him. He brings it up with her and that doesn't happen. I still think it's going to happen. It hasn't yet. Finally, the mom, Christine, I think, she says, "I'm getting rid of the dog today. Like, I can't do this anymore." Ivan goes over to her place, and she's kind of just like drawn him in to talk about why him and Peter aren't talking to each other anymore, because Peter has told her that they're no contact right now. And while Ivan is there, he's kind of just like seething with rage at this family that he feels so different and so othered from. And while he's doing this, he thinks about Margaret, and he thinks about her compassion and her love for the people around her. And in this moment, he decides to have compassion for his family and to just kind of get out of there without like turning it into this huge thing. So he just takes the dog and he leaves, and he's like going off. He's feeling so righteous, and then he's kind of like, what am I gonna do with this fucking dog? Like, I actually have no plan on what to do with the dog. Then we jump back to Peter's perspective, and he's gone over to where Sylvia lectures to meet her up with her so he can kind of just like complain about his life. And he goes up to her office when she doesn't exit the lecture hall, and he finds one of her coworkers, and they say, "Oh, Sylvia's not here today, she's out sick." And Peter's like, "Oh my God, I'm such a selfish asshole. Like, I was going to complain about my life. I forgot that she's in near constant excruciating pain from the injuries from this accident that she was in." And this is a really interesting paragraph that I'm going to read to you that I really liked. "Don't worry, it was nothing. I just wanted to complain about my mother, brother, about my work, my personal life. I forgot again, or studiously suppressed the certain knowledge that you are very often and presumably right now in excruciating pain. It's just something I prefer not to contemplate." Peter's also feeling a little bit offended that Sylvia hasn't told him that she's not doing well, so he texts her and asks if there's anything that she needs, and she asks him to just pick up her medication from the pharmacy and drop it off outside her door. And he says, "Oh, do you have COVID symptoms? Like, I could bring you some tests," trying to get at the reason why she doesn't want him in her house. He's quite offended by this, I think. And she says, no, I'm just in a lot of pain. Just the medication will be fine." He goes to her house. Obviously, he's such a fucking dick. He knocks on her door. She's like, "Please just leave it outside the door." He says, "I have a key. I'm just going to come in and make sure you're all right." At this point, I'm like, oh my God, Peter. I hate you so much. So he barges into her house against her wishes and finds that she is on the ground in the living room in pain beside like a bowl full of vomit and her phone. And he's like, oh, she didn't want me to come in because she didn't want me to see her like this. Of course, not everything is about fucking meat all the time. She's like, please just go. And he's like being a hero. He's such a savior. He's like, no, I'll wait for you until you feel good enough and then I'll help you get up into bed. Finally, she's like, okay, the medication's kicked in. I'm going to get into bed. He takes her into bed. They lie down together. They kind of start talking and cuddling. They're talking about their breakup and how she broke up with him because she didn't want him to resent her, and that he always felt like she's been holding that over her head, like the breakup was all for his sake and had nothing to do with how she felt, that she had made this act of sacrifice and that he couldn't really pay her back for it. They're talking about how he feels that she likes that he kind of humiliates himself trying to get her back, get her to take him back. She says, like, I kind of do. Like, it is flattering to know that you want me and that in this body I can still be wanted by you. And then he starts kissing her. They start making out. He like kind of just gets her to jerk him off. That whole scene, I hated it so fucking much. First of all, she's sick. Leave her the fuck alone. I don't know. It just felt so deeply icky to me. And I honestly think that that's something that Sally Rooney does really well. And that is that her intentions as the author evade me. I don't know what she's intending with any scene. I feel like she's just kind of like laying things out for me, and then I get to interpret it however I want without really being able to consider how she was meaning it to be interpreted. I don't know if there is an intended way of understanding this relationship between these two people or a way that she wanted me to feel about this. I think that that is genuinely really skilled, but also like part of me is like, do you think this is okay? Somewhat, in some ways, it feels like it's portrayed as romantic, but then I don't really think that that's what she meant. I don't know what she meant. And I think that that has come up a lot in her works. Just generally, in everything I've read from her, there is a sense of like strong nuance with everything that she writes. It can be a little bit exhausting to parse it yourself, though. So like I said, I am really bored by this. I'm kind of tired of the melodrama. All of her books are incredibly melodramatic, and I'm just like, it's a bit much for me. I think that this book would bore me whether or not I had just read 3 other Sally Rooney books back to back to back. It's just kind of a boring book. I don't care all that much about the characters or their dynamics. I do think Ivan is really interesting, but honestly, like, the gimmick is up. Like, I get it. You're trying to write an autistic character, but not explicitly say that he's autistic, so you don't have to do all that much research, and it's kind of just like a shallow portrayal of like what autism in males might look like, and I'm kind of tired of it. I don't think it's problematic or anything like that. I just think it's just a bit surface level. For some reason, I think that now that I've got this filming off my plate, I'll feel more motivated to get the rest of this book done. I don't know why I think that, I just do. So I'm gonna go try to do that right now. Fuck, I really don't want to. Okay, give me a sec. UPS is about to knock on my fucking door right now. This is the real problem. This is really why I can't read intermezzo right now. Look at this sweater that I'm making. Fuck. I got a package. I have a pair of these. Okay, so I'll move the box. Stop making the box noises. I have a pair of these right here, which are a bit ratty. I have changed these earpads out. They used to be like literally fully the leather was gone. It was just green foam. 6 years old, I think they are. They're still kind of going strong. To be honest, I'm going to be vulnerable here. They stink, which is so gross. I put them on. I wear them all the time. Like literally constantly 24/7 I wear them. I put them on immediately after getting out of the shower. And I think maybe like the wetness from my hair has seeped into the foam. And now they stink and they make my head stink. It's really gross. I should not be sharing that information. Anyway, these are on the brink of death. They still work, but it's really iffy. Okay, they look almost the exact same. Do they look good? Wow, they're a lot more noise canceling. They're not even on. The button works. They're not charged. Oh! Okay, they're freaking me out. They're talking to me. Here, wait. I wonder if I can get you to listen to that. I'm sure you can hear the cat meowing. If that's the noise it makes every time I turn them on, I'm gonna have to have a word with Bose, because that's really intense. Anyway, all this to say, I'm just trying to show you the fucking sweater that I'm making. Jesus Christ. Can you tell what it is? Tell me you can tell when it is, because when you are knitting something and you're looking at it up close for a long time, it really feels like it just looks like absolute gibberish. So yeah, when this is the other thing that I want to do, create this incredible bug sweater, it's very hard to motivate myself to read a really boring book. I'm going to try, though. That's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to finish Intermezzo. I got this. We got this. Hello, I have finally, after what feels like 200 billion years, finished Intermezzo by Sally Rooney. This was my least favorite Sally Rooney book, and also the longest book she's ever written, and I'm so happy to be getting it off my chest and out of my head. It isn't a bad book. It's not a book for me, and I felt like I was dragging myself through this. This is the first time in a video. I need to not do this again. I need to not read all of an author's works because it's really easy to get very bored of them. And I did. And this was the first time I've made a video where I felt like I wanted to fucking quit. Like, I was just so done. I just did not want to pick this up. I'm so oversaturated with the Sally Rooney, with the melodrama. Even though I do like her work and I like her as a writer, I'm over it at this point. Oh my God, if she had 5 books, I'd be done. I'm not going to get into like gruesome detail about how I would kill myself, but I just know that I would. I don't have all that much to say because I want to stop thinking about this book. I want to do something that interests me, and that was not Intermezzo for me. So we're going to go through what happens in the rest of the book really quickly. Margaret has an encounter with Ollie, who's a guy that we met way at the beginning of the book and was part of like the chess club that was hosting this event with Ivan where Margaret and Ivan met. And Ollie mentions that he saw Ivan walking around town, and Margaret is like, oh my God, he's implying that he knows that I'm seeing Ivan, and he's like making fun of me, and everyone in the town knows, and my mom's gonna find out, and my ex-husband's gonna find out. It's like this whole huge thing. She's there with her friend Anna, who I love. We don't get to see much of. Anna's like, is this about someone that you're seeing? And she's just like, won't tell her anything, but Anna doesn't push because she's lovely. It freaks Margaret right out, and she's so paranoid, and she feels so alone, like she can't tell anybody about this. Then we go to Peter, and Peter goes and he gets drunk with his coworkers, and then he goes back to his place, and he breaks up with Naomi. This is almost immediately after he's had this sexual encounter with Sylvia, and he's like, I'm in love with Sylvia. She's the woman I've wanted all along, and I can't do this thing with both of you. It's not allowed in society. We're going to be outcasted for this. Even though both women know about each other and they're both fine with it, he goes home plastered and he says, Naomi, you have to leave. And she's like, oh, is it because of Sylvia? And he's like, yeah. And then he kind of tells her more about the situation with Sylvia and how they dated, and then she got in this accident. And Naomi, like, we don't honestly get to know all that much about her and her perspective until closer to the end of the book. She responds like very level-headed, very kind and gracious, and says like, that just sounds like a really sad situation, but also I have literally nowhere to go. What am I gonna do? So Peter's like, you can go stay at my dad's place in Kildare, or wherever the fuck that is. You can go stay at his empty house. Now Ivan has the dog. Okay, so Ivan is also staying at this empty house. He still has Peter's number blocked. They have not interacted with each other at all. Ivan has the dog. He goes and stays with Margaret for a bit, and then he goes back to the house, and he opens the door, and who's there but Naomi? Peter's not there, but she is. The two of them talk. Ivan gets kind of upset in this conversation because he had no idea who Naomi was, and he's like, oh my God, my brother's such a fucking hypocrite. This woman is my age. Naomi is saying things to Peter that Peter doesn't want to hear, but again, she is kind and gracious and thoughtful and funny. She's lovely. She has a lovely personality, and I like that all these different times where she is put in this horrible situation because of Peter, she just reacts. I don't know. I think what I'm saying is she has every right to react with anger or to explode or to get upset, and she doesn't. She's just like kind of a really good person, but then at the same time that's also frustrating because it's like, get the fuck away from Peter. I literally hate this dude so much. So Naomi and Ivan are kind of staying in this house together. Back with Peter, he goes to Sylvia and he says, Sylvia, I broke up with Naomi. You're the woman that I want. I'm in love with you. Let's spend the rest of our lives together. And Sylvia's like, what the fuck? What is wrong with you? That's not what I wanted. I was fine with you seeing Naomi. I actually feel way worse about you wanting only me. That's way too much pressure for me. And like, you've only put your needs first. You don't care what I think or what I want. Everything is always about you. They get in this huge fight. Peter's kind of like, I'm gonna go kill myself. And he's like, well, shit. If Sylvia's gonna reject me, I'll just go back to fucking Naomi, who I've just kicked out of my house. So he goes back to the house in Kildare. Who's there but Ivan? Naomi's gone out with her friends. Ivan is there. The two of them start talking. They get into this huge fight where Peter's saying a lot of shitty things, maybe not quite shitty things, but he's saying things about their father that Ivan doesn't want to hear. Things I think that Ivan knows are true about Peter and their dad's relationship. And it's kind of this thing where in saying them, Peter is like bringing forth the reality that their dad isn't there anymore, because these are things that he never would have said if his dad was alive. Ivan ends up pushing Peter, and Peter slaps Ivan hard, throws him to the ground, and then like rears back to kick him before he really realizes what he's doing when he sees the fear in Ivan's eyes. So he leaves the house. He's also, just to be clear, still very drunk. He leaves the house, throws up everywhere. Again, you think, is Peter going to kill himself? But he doesn't. He keeps like being near train tracks, and you're like, this is the moment where it's going to happen. Of course, it never does. He ends up going back to his apartment, and when he opens the door, Naomi and Sylvia are both there in his apartment. They had both been trying to get a hold of him. His phone was dead, and they thought something terrible had happened. So Naomi ended up looking up Sylvia's email address. The two of them met up, and they went into his apartment because Sylvia has a key. They were like, oh my God, the next thing we were going to do was call your mom. Like, we thought something terrible had happened to you. The two of them like seem to be hitting it off quite well, and I really like the dynamic between the two of them. Whereas Peter's all freaked out. He fully like faints onto the ground. Like he does not know what is happening in his life. Everything's falling apart around him, and these two women being together in the same room, though they both knew about each other and were fine with the other one's like presence in his life, it's too much for him. He faints. Back with Margaret and Ivan. Ivan, after this fight, calls Margaret. He's really upset. He goes to see her, and when they see each other, Margaret she's told her mom about him at the same time here, and her mom reacted kind of how she was expecting her to react. And when she sees Ivan, she comes to this conclusion that like it's worth being unconventional. It is worth all of the things people might say or think about us to be with him. And that is the last chapter following Ivan and Margaret. I've probably been saying their names wrong. Did I just say Peter and Margaret a second ago? I might have. You know what I'm talking about. We go back for the last time for 40 fucking pages to Peter's perspective. Him and Sylvia go on a walk, and they kind of talk about their feelings and talk about what's happening in their relationship and what they want out of their relationship. And Sylvia's like, I want you to see both of us. And Peter's like, oh, I can't do that. What are people going to say? That's not allowed in society. But he ends up kind of just getting this perfect ending handed to him on a silver fucking platter, and then he tries to be conflicted about it still for some reason. Naomi and Sylvia both want to be in his life, and they're both happy with the other one giving him what they can't give him, like whatever the fuck it is. They like this like open relationship thing. Both women are for it, and Peter's just like, oh my God, this is terrible. I'm getting exactly what I wanted. So Peter, who's been dealing with this suicidality, mental health struggle, suffering in silence like a man, being isolated and alone, not feeling like he has anyone to talk about his feelings with, he all of a sudden has this light bulb moment where he's like, actually, life is worth living. He says, like, there's books that I haven't read yet. The opening theme of Concerto Number 24. My friends, students, colleagues, their familiar voices. What has not yet been lost, what is still, at least for this moment, remains. That's word for word. No, it's not. I thought that was super fucking corny. I thought that felt like it was written by someone who has no experience with suicidality, being like, this is what happens. This is how people get out of it. All of a sudden, they decide, maybe things are okay in the end. And I hated it. Stupid. The book closes with Peter showing up at Ivan's chess thing. It's like kind of a big deal, but not really. He's like on his way to making some big title in chess. Peter shows up, but he doesn't go inside. Him and Ivan have not spoken to each other since this like big fist fight that they got into. And when he's there, a woman shows up, and she also doesn't go inside, and they look at each other and they realize, I know who you are. There's just like a moment of understanding between them. And Margaret and Peter introduce themselves. They have actually a really nice chat. They are both very kind to each other, which, thank fucking God, it was a little bit tense wondering what Peter was going to do, but also knowing that he was going to end up treating her like a human, and this was helpful for both of them, for both of their perceptions of the other person. Peter thinking Margaret was this weird, like, monster taking advantage of his brother, and Margaret only ever hearing Ivan's side of arguments with Peter, and probably seeing Peter as like a pretty shitty guy, not a very good brother. So they're both pleasantly surprised with how kind the other one is. After Ivan wins this chess match and it finishes up, Margaret goes inside and tells him, hey, Peter's outside. He's waiting for you. Peter thinks Ivan's not going to come and see me. I don't even know why I showed up. But Ivan does, and as soon as Peter sees him, he starts to cry. Ivan's like, hey, let's go for a walk, buddy. Like, let's go outside. And they have this really nice chat where they just kind of reflect on what each other has done wrong, and they apologize for things, and they talk about how they've each wronged the other one. It's very sweet. At the end of it, Ivan invites Peter to Christmas with him and Margaret. He says, you can bring Naomi and Sylvia. Like I said, Peter gets everything just like perfectly handed to him. Everyone just caters to him beautifully, and that's just like kind of it. That's his arc. So at the end of this, I really was just happy that it was over. I don't think this is a bad book, but I think that the only really great thing about this book is that it is objectively well written, and it's not written in a way that I personally like, so I couldn't enjoy the only thing that I thought was like really well done about it. And that made me hate it. I can't say it enough. This book was so fucking boring. All of her books are plotless, and that has been fine up until this point. I have been driven to pick them up. I've wanted to know more about the characters. I felt connected to the characters, and it didn't really matter to me that they didn't have a plot until Intermezzo. This felt like a chore every single time that I picked it up. Even once picking it up, never at any point did I feel like, oh, I'm actually getting into this. I'm actually really liking this. The whole time I'm looking down thinking that I was another page ahead, and I wasn't. And the chapters are very long, and the book is very long. It was just like a difficult time in my life. I found it to be tedious in every aspect. Like I said, it's not my writing style. This kind of like Emer McBride, James Joyce sort of like stream of consciousness, very choppy, kind of unfinished sentences, sometimes gibberish like kind of thing. Not for me. And I understand we're writing an Irish literary tradition, whatever, but I don't think it's ever going to be something that I enjoy, even if it's done pretty well. I have read it done not very well, and I can see the difference, but I still find it very difficult to read. I also found the characters to be tedious. I thought that they just got more grating over the course of the book, more insufferable. The characters that I did like had very little time in the spotlight, and I wanted to see more from them and not hear about these annoying fucking brothers. I also think this book treats itself a little bit like it's revolutionizing like unconventional relationships, but it's like open relationships and age gap relationships. I don't feel like she was doing anything like crazy or liberating. I think that's kind of a thread I've seen through her works. Like, it feels like maybe Sally Rooney has come from quite a religious or like puritanical background. And so she does these things where she talks about things that are like really quite vanilla in like everyday life, maybe a little bit out there for contemporary media or like popular media. Oh my God, Marianne Sheridan likes to be degraded during sex, and everyone's like, put her to death. You know what I mean? It's too much. So very quickly, I'm going to wrap up my experience with all of Sally Rooney's works, how it's been inhabiting the Rooneyverse for the last like week and a half. First and foremost, these bitches are writing too many fucking emails. People do not write that many emails. I cannot believe there are people who write as many emails as the characters in the Sally Rooney books do. Or people who peel as many oranges or wipe their nose so frequently with their fingers. It was constant. So I think I'll never do this again. I think that's what I've learned, is that this is not like a fun experience. Never while making a video have I hated the video by the end of it. I just got really tired of this like repetition, which of course I did. Like, I read only Sally Rooney books for the last week and a half. Obviously I was going to get bored of it. I don't know. I thought it was going to be like some immersive sort of thing. It wasn't. It was just like a task, and I don't want making content to be a task. I like to read and I like to make videos, and I don't want to hate either of those things. And this video just about pushed me there. So I will never do this again. But I did enjoy, in some ways, reading her works like this, because you kind of feel like you're growing up with her, because her characters match her age. I liked reading it chronologically like this and feeling like I was progressing in age with Sally Rooney. I thought that that was like really fun and insightful. Unfortunately, I think that what she does best is lost in her later works. I think that the strongest thing in her writing is her characterization, her creation of like this connection between the reader and the characters, and her sharp and witty dialogue. That was kind of petering out in Beautiful World, Where Are You? And I didn't see it anywhere in Intermezzo. And that kind of makes me worried about where we're headed in the Rooneyverse. I would like to read more from her. Never again like this. Maybe just like little doses of Sally Rooney. That would be wonderful. I'm not completely put off from her work. I don't want it to be like Intermezzo, though. I really didn't like that. I much prefer her first 2 books. Hugely, what I got from making this video is that I understand the appeal of Sally Rooney. I think that her books are written very well, they're accessible, and they have depth. Like, accessibility and depth, you can't really ask for more than that. The characters are real and relatable, and they reflect like universal aspects of the human experience, and that's wonderful, and she does it very well. That's the end of the video. I don't really have anything more to say about Sally Rooney other than I'm relieved that it's over at this point. Honestly, I kind of felt like they got increasingly worse. Like, I think that her first book is my favorite, and then I like them less as time goes on, which is really not what I was expecting. And that's not to say that they are like worse or like she lacks skill in her later works. I think you can see her skill develop, just not in a way that I like. I liked her less skilled work. Sorry. Thank you so much for watching. Come and join the book club right now. It's not too late. You still have time this month, but if you don't want to, you can come just join. Come have little discussions with us. We don't only talk about the book that we're reading, and you can read next month's book, Jillian by Hallie Butler. Right now we're reading Song of Solomon. You have time. Like, you can do that. You got to get over there right now. Join the Discord.